And so today brings the end of 2021. Now, although we've tried to make the best of this year given all the news that's been circulating, I sadly have to end the year off with a record that has been broken over in London. Now, what's this record, you might be asking yourself? Well, 2021 has officially been announced as the year with the highest recorded number of teenage homicides since records started. A very sad state of affairs indeed, but believe it or not, before yesterday, 2021 hadn't been the highest. It was in fact 2008, which had held the record of 29 teenage murders in 1 year. What I think is most shocking though is that yesterday there wasn't just one teenager murdered in the capital, it was two, and they were only 30 minutes apart, again making 2021 the highest on record. Let's just let that sink in for one moment. Either way, for this first report, we've got to head over to Croydon, and at around 7 PM, emergency services were called to Ashburton Park to reports of an assault. When they arrived, they found a 15-year-old boy suffering from stab injuries. He was initially still alive when emergency services reached the park, but despite the best efforts from paramedics, he would sadly go on to be pronounced dead at roughly 7:36 PM. As it stands right now, no one has been arrested in connection with the incident. The killer remains at large and lines of inquiry are still continuing. Right now, a motive hasn't been given by police, but according to witnesses who've spoke to My London News, they've gone on to say there were two gangs of boys running about, shouting, one dressed all in black with scarves on their face. Cars came and they were picked up quickly. The victim's friend was screaming for help, crying, screaming, asking cars to do something. When emergency services finally arrived, they were trying to revive him and his friends were sitting there by the curb. The helicopter came, but by then it was too late. Sadly though, the next incident took place quite literally 2 minutes before the 15-year-old boy was pronounced dead. Roughly 34 minutes after emergency services had been called to the scene in Croydon, they were called once again to Philpotts Farm open space in Hillingdon to reports of a 16-year-old boy with a stab injury. When they arrived at the scene, despite the best efforts of paramedics, the 16-year-old boy would go on to be pronounced dead, making the number of teenage murders 30 this year, the worst on record. After the recent incident, local residents spoke to My London News, where they told reporters that where in London is safe anymore, especially when trying to bring up a family. One resident said, "This is my first flat, and when I asked everyone, even the estate agent, they said it's a nice place to live and start a family. It is nice, but this has really scared me. Where in London is safe? Is there anywhere?" And I really do feel for local residents that have to go through this on a daily basis, because at the end of the day, we have to remember that only big reports come out when actual murders take place. Sometimes, a lot of the time, non-fatal stabbings and shootings don't even get reported on in the news. Sometimes a police statement isn't even given, so you can only imagine what it's like for local residents. But it wasn't just these two incidents that happened last night. Believe it or not, around the same time at 7:21 PM, another knife attack took place in Orpington, where police were called to St Mary Cray train station. When they arrived, a man and a woman were found with knife injuries not believed to be life-threatening. To me though, it seems like the rise in teenage deaths due to knife crime is because every teen is quite literally arming themselves with a knife, more than likely in fear of an attack. We've got to a point now where fists aren't thrown anymore in a dispute, it's knives. The majority are probably not even out to kill. Remember, a lot of these are just kids themselves, the perpetrators. It seems like they just want to settle the dispute, but ultimately they go on to use a knife, and before you know it, they've gone on to kill someone.
My name is Alex Murray. I'm a commander in the Met Police responsible for getting violence down in London. Thanks very much for coming today. First and foremost, I can't imagine the pain that the families of loved ones, two who have died last night, are feeling right now. It must be incredibly raw, and I know the thoughts of all the people I work with in the Met are with the mums, dads and families and brothers and sisters of the young people who died last night. I do want to reassure you and say that violence and tackling violence and youth violence is our number one priority in London. Right from dealing with county lines through to taking money and drugs and guns off the streets, through to being in the right place at the right time, policing hotspots of violence, and then getting upstream. We've got hundreds of police officers who work in schools, all trying really hard to tackle violence at its causes. Now, as a result of that effort, and with partners and with community groups and with the local authority, we have seen over the last few years significant reductions in violence, in knife crime and gun crime, but not for teenagers. For teenagers, we have had an increase in homicides. And I guess my message today, other than to speaking to the families and friends of those that London has lost tonight, is to say you cannot carry knives in London. This is what happens when knives are carried. And we all have a role in relation to tackling knife crime. Anybody can ring Crime Stoppers, an independent charity, and call and say this person's got a knife or someone's carrying a knife, and action will be taken. We take about 400 knives a month off the streets from young people who are carrying knives, but in actual fact everybody has a role to play here and is playing, and I just encourage anybody who knows if someone is carrying a knife, tell them not to. We know people get hurt if you carry knives. It's not something you should carry if you're fearful. If you're fearful, don't carry a knife. That's the main comment. I'd encourage everybody to get involved. You've seen how we work with community groups to tackle violence. This is a local problem, a family problem, a community problem, a police problem, a local authority problem. We've all got a role to play to make sure that we reduce these tragedies that are taking place. Yeah, so the tragedy is teenage murders are up. Total murder rate and knife crime is down, and we are doing a lot of different things. We're investing in prevention, putting officers in schools, as I mentioned. We do a thing called problem solving, where we work in a particular area where violence might spike, and we go, what are the causes here? And we work with partners to deal with those causes of crime. And things like county lines, which does affect teenagers so much more. We've charged thousands of people with county lines, both here in London and people exporting drugs to some of the towns around the UK. So a huge amount of effort is going on with thousands and thousands of police officers, both in the prevention space and also in detecting crime and getting justice for victims. The detection rate for homicide in London is nearly 95%. You know, it's very high, and there's a lot of, I've just been speaking to detectives involved in the case. A huge amount of effort has gone in getting justice for victims and actually solving the homicides when they happen. Well, you're right about the disproportionality, and it's the disproportionality we don't hear about so much. So you know, young lads in London, and it's young black lads in London largely, who are affected more than anyone else. And we need to really start understanding that and dealing with it. And from a policing point of view, it's represented in our data. You know, when we look at people who are both victims and who are charged with homicide, we see disproportionality, and it's something we've got to work really hard on dealing with. And again, that's not just the police, that's all of us working together in the public sector, but also in the private sector, and also families, NGOs, community groups, churches. We tackle that by building relationships. Now, you've spoken to Anthony earlier. Through the good times and through the bad times, the police will never leave, and the community groups will never leave. We've got to work together. The bigger picture is stopping young people getting hurt that you've just described. That's what the police care about. That's what the community groups care about. And when we realise that both our motivations are really good in tackling that, that's when we start to build trust. And you've seen here in Croydon, over the last 18 months, you know, bridges being built between community groups and the police, because we realise that our motivation is to make a change and to tackle what you've described around teenage homicides.